In this video, we're going to have a look at how we can calculate with percentage in two different ways. In our first way, we're going to consider how we calculate the percentage of an amount. To help us with this, we're going to start with how we find the fraction of an amount, which means we want to find part of a total value. And the total value I'm going to use in our examples is the value 30. So our total value is going to be 30. So let's consider finding 1/5 of 30. Visually, this means if we take our total value of 30, we want to cut it into 5 equal pieces and we want to take just one of them. So if we think about this, we're simply saying get 30 and divide it into 5 equal pieces because of our denominator, which will give us 6. That means one part is worth 6. So all of these parts here individually are worth 6. We want to take one part of them, so 1/5 of 30 would be 6. Via a calculation method, to find 1/5 of 30, of means times, and 30 is a whole number we can place over 1. So if we look at it in terms of multiplying two fractions, where we can put all our numerators together and denominators together, we end up with 30 over 5, which does equal 6. Knowing 1/5 of 30, let's have a look at this if we were asked to find 3/5 of 30. Again, visually, we could use our whole 30, cutting it into 5 equal pieces, but this time we want to take 3 of them. So we could say that 30 divided 5 is 6 for one part, but we want 3 lots of those parts, so this would mean we would have 18, because each part is individually worth 6. Completing a calculation, 3/5 of, which means lots of, 30 over 1 is a whole. What we can do here, because we've got multiplication, we can simplify the 30 and the 5. 5 goes into 5 once, 5 goes into 36 times, which leaves us with 3 times 6 over 1, which leaves 18. So 3/5 of 30 equals 18. So using a fraction to find a part of a total value is quite easy. So let's use this idea with percentages. Now let's consider finding the percentage of an amount. We're going to use 30 as our total value again. So this time I'm going to think about 10% of 30. Finding 10%. Now, one thing we know about 10%, 10% is the same as 10 over 100 or 1 over 10. So it's 1/10. So in terms of a fraction, we're actually saying we want to find 1/10 of 30. So we know this is like getting our total value of 30, cutting it into 10 pieces and taking just one of them. So 30 over 10 is equal to 3, and that's just one part. Also, dividing by 10 is obviously taking 10%. And we know when we divide a whole number by 10, we grab its decimal point at the end and we move it left one place. So 10% is actually moving that decimal point back one, and it tells us what 10% is. So 30, 10% is 3. If we're doing a calculation of 10% of 30, we know this is a percentage. So percentages are measured out of 100, and that's lots of 30 over 1. So if we wanted to perform a calculation using multiplication, we can do lots of simplifying here. We can say 10 divide 10, So we end up with 1/10 of 30. And then 10 goes into itself once, and 10 goes into 30 3 times. And we end up with 1 lot of 3 over 1, which is simply 3. So 10% of 30 is in fact 3. Now we know 10% of 30, it'd be really easy for us to find 20% of 30. Because we know 1 part, or 10%, 20% would just be 2 lots of 3, so that would be worth 6. 40% of 30 would just going to be 4 lots of the 10%, which would be 12. Let's have a look at this as a calculation. 40% is 40 out of 100 of 30 over 1. So again, this is like saying I want 4/10 of 30. So it means cutting 30 into 10 pieces, and we want 4 of them. Or if we simplified 10 and 30, simply going to be 4 lots of 3, and we get 40% is 12. What that also allows us to work out, because we know that 10% of 30 is 3, 5% of 30 is going to be 1.5, because it's going to be half of 3. If we wanted to find 110% of 30, which means we want 100% of it plus 10%, it's very easy to make it over 100%. The question is, if 10% of 30 was 10 over 100, lots of 30, which gave us 3, I wonder what 1% of 30 would be. Remembering 1% is 1/100th of 30. We're dividing by 100. So this tells me we're going to get our decimal point and divide it by 100. So we end up with 0.3, 1%. Now I'd like you to pause the video and have a go at the following 3 questions, finding 10% of 60, 30% of 60, and 2% of 60. Checking our answers. 10% of 60, getting that decimal point, it's 1/10, so we want to divide by 10, so it is going to be 6. If 10% is worth 6, then 30% would simply be 3 lots of that 6, which will be 18. So if we want to find 2% of 60, let's find 1% first, which is dividing that by 100, which gets us 0.6. So 2% would be 2 lots of 0.6, which will be 1.2. In our second type of calculation, we want to express a value as a percentage. This reminds me of the test score. In a recent quiz, we had our score out of 46. So imagine we scored 40 out of 46. What is this as a percentage? Now remember we talked about a fraction being part of a whole. So this is 4 out of 46 marks, the whole test, the one whole test. So we want to go from this being measured out of one whole test to being measured out of 100. So we simply need to get that fraction and multiply it by 100. Now if we have a calculator, this would be very easy to do. 40 divide 46. That gives us a fraction, or a decimal, which is not very nice, 0.8695, etc. But if we times that by 100, it tells us we've got 86.96%. So we just want to get 100 times that, so it's out of 100. Let's take a look at some simpler examples. Let's imagine our test score was 42 out of 50. We want that as a percentage, which means we want it out of 100 or over 100. Now in this case, that's very simple to do. We're going to just double everything to make the values increase to out of 100, which means it's 84 out of 100. We scored 84%. If we had a test that was out of 35 and we scored 21 out of 35, it's very hard to get this out of 100, but perhaps we can find a common link between 21 and 35. They both could be divided by 7. That means we could get our value out of 5, which in fact would be 3/5, and then we could times by 20, and we would end up with 60 out of 100, so it's 60%. But what happens when they're not nice values? Let's take a look at 67 over 80. So out of 80 marks on a test, we receive 67. We actually just want to know how much of this is going to be out of 100. So we're simply going to find this part or this fraction of 100. So we grab our calculator and do 67 divide 80, and that gives us 0.8375. So we want to just times that by 100. And timesing by 100, we get 83.75%. So when we want something out of 100, we simply want to times by 100 to increase its size to, instead of out of one whole, out of 100.